Trump invited this soldier to the White House, but what happened at the ceremony left everyone in tears. Jake Callahan woke up before dawn. The sound of an alarm clock wasn't necessary. For years, his body had been programmed to wake up at the same time without fail. The habit, built during his military years, never left him, even now, away from the battlefield. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his unshaven face. His gaze drifted toward the window of his small ranch on the outskirts of Dallas, Texas. Outside, the early morning sky was painted with orange hues. His morning routine was simple: strong coffee, a few push-ups to get the muscles going, and a 5-mile run along the dirt road. But that morning, something felt different. As he tied his bootlaces, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Something inside him whispered that this day would change his life. The phone call. The sharp ring of the phone made Jake pause mid-motion. He stared at the device as if it were a bomb about to go off. It had been a long time since he'd received an unexpected call. "Hello? Is this Sergeant Callahan?" The voice on the other end was firm but respectful. "Who's asking?" "I'm calling from the White House, sir. President Donald Trump would like to speak with you." Jake remained silent. He thought he had misheard. "And to repeat that, the President would like to speak with you, Sergeant. Please hold." Jake's heart pounded. Within seconds, a familiar voice came through the line. "Jake Callahan," Trump said in his unmistakable tone. "We finally found you." Jake straightened up, feeling the weight of the call. "Sir, it's an honor to speak with you." "The honor is mine, soldier. The entire country needs to know what you did. And I personally want to thank you." Jake didn't know how to respond. He never sought recognition, never wanted the spotlight. To him, he had simply done his duty. Trump continued, "We need you here in Washington. There's a plane ready to pick you up. Do you accept?" Jake closed his eyes for a moment. Memories of his mission in Afghanistan began flooding his mind. Explosions, screams, blood. He took a deep breath. "When do I leave?" The answer came instantly. "Right now." Jake Callahan stood motionless for a moment, still holding the phone. The President of the United States had just personally requested his presence in Washington. Washington, the White House, national recognition. None of it made sense. He never saw himself as a hero, never expected a thank you. The mission in Afghanistan was a weight he carried in silence, far from cameras and patriotic speeches. But now, the most powerful man in the country was asking to see him. He took a deep breath and answered firmly, "I'm on my way, sir." "Good. The whole country is waiting to thank you." The call ended, and Jake remained still. He looked around his simple house. In the corner of the living room, framed photographs told the story of his life. His wedding day, the birth of his 2 children, the first time he wore the uniform. And next to those memories was another image, one he rarely looked at for too long. A picture of his team in Afghanistan, all smiling, arms crossed, full of life. Not all of them came home. Jake looked away and stood up. There was no time for nostalgia. If the President wanted him in Washington, he was going. The flight to Washington. 2 hours later, Jake was sitting inside a private military jet, cutting through the skies toward the nation's capital. He felt the weight of the occasion, but tried to push his emotions aside. A U.S. Air Force officer sitting beside him broke the silence. "Sergeant, I just wanted to say it's an honor to be on this flight with you." Jake looked at the young lieutenant. He couldn't have been more than 25, his eyes filled with admiration. "I just did my job, Lieutenant." "With all due respect, sir, it was more than that." Jake turned his gaze to the window. Below him, fields and cities passed by in a blur. He tried not to think about what awaited him, but he knew that once he landed in Washington, he would have to face his past like never before. Arrival in Washington. When the plane touched down at Andrews Air Force Base, Jake was met by 2 Secret Service agents. "Sergeant Callahan, welcome to Washington." He simply nodded, his eyes going straight to the official car waiting for him. Without time for questions, he was escorted inside, and the vehicle took off toward the White House. As the streets of the Capitol flashed past the window, a tightness formed in his chest. Something inside him told him this day would change everything. And he was right. Jake Callahan kept his eyes fixed on the city, passing by outside the car window. The streets of Washington were busy, but he barely noticed the movement. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in memories he had spent months trying to suppress. The driver remained silent, while the two Secret Service agents in the front exchanged brief words over the radio. Everything followed a strict protocol. Jake forced himself to take a deep breath. It wasn't his first time in the Capitol. He had been here before for military events and strategic briefings. But this time was different. He wasn't just another soldier among many. This time, all eyes were on him, and that made him uneasy. The past that haunted him without realizing it, his hands had clenched into fists. He felt the familiar tingling of the scars on his arms, scars that had never been fully explained to the doctors. He knew what had caused each one. Explosions, hand-to-hand combat, sleepless nights in the Afghan desert. But there was one scar no one could see, the voice of a wounded comrade calling for help. The smell of gunpowder and blood mixing in the hot night air, the sound of bullets cutting through the wind, each one meaning life or death. Jake blinked hard, forcing himself back into the present. The car slowed as they approached the White House gates. The imposing iron entrance opened slowly, revealing the historic building beyond. A meeting with history. When the car came to a stop, a high-ranking officer opened the door. "Sergeant Callahan, welcome." Jake stepped out and instinctively straightened his posture. The uniform he wore wasn't for combat, yet he carried the weight of a soldier with every step. As he climbed the White House steps, he felt the weight of the eyes on him. Advisors, military officials, reporters at a distance. He was a man trained for impossible missions, but facing this moment felt harder than any battle. The Oval Office. The hallways were silent. A Secret Service agent guided him without saying a word until they stopped in front of a set of double doors. "You may enter, sir." Jake took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The Oval Office was exactly as he had imagined, and at the center of it, standing behind the presidential desk, was Donald Trump. The president looked up and offered a small smile. "Jake Callahan." Sir." "We finally meet." Jake nodded, still stiff. But then Trump did something unexpected. He stepped out from behind the desk and extended his hand. "Relax, soldier. Here, you're among brothers." Jake hesitated for a second. Then he shook the president's hand. It was in that moment that he realized this wasn't just a ceremony. Something much bigger was about to happen. Jake Callahan firmly shook President Trump's hand. He had greeted generals, commanders, and even foreign leaders throughout his military career, but this was different. This wasn't just a formality. There was something personal in Trump's gaze, as if he truly understood the weight of what this meeting meant. The president gestured toward a chair across from his desk. "Take a seat, soldier." Jake followed the order without question. His military training made him naturally reserved, but his mind was racing. He still didn't fully understand why he was here. Trump sat down across from him, resting his elbows on the desk. "I've read your story, Jake. I've seen the reports from your mission in Afghanistan. What you did out there, very few men would have had the courage to do that." Jake remained silent. He knew exactly what the president was referring to, but he never liked revisiting those memories. "Sir, I just did my job." Trump smirked slightly. "All great heroes say that." Jake looked away for a moment. He had never wanted to be called a hero. He had never sought recognition, but the president continued. "I need you to understand something, Jake. That night in Afghanistan wasn't just another military operation. You saved lives, and not just the lives of the hostages. You saved your fellow soldiers. You changed the course of history." Jake's face remained serious. Deep down, a part of him knew those words were true, but accepting them was something else entirely. Trump leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. But that's not the only reason I brought you here. Jake furrowed his brow. Sir! The president gestured toward an aide waiting near the door. The man quickly stepped forward and handed Trump a tablet. You rescued American hostages, Jake. But I want to show you something you might not know. Trump tapped the screen, and a video began to play. Jake glanced at the screen, and his heart stopped for a moment. The video that changed everything. The footage appeared to be recorded with a cell phone. The shaky image showed a group of people seated in a modest room. American flags were taped to the walls, and a small stage had been set up at the front. Then, a woman stepped forward into the frame. Jake recognized her immediately. She was one of the hostages he had rescued. She held a microphone with trembling hands. Her voice was thick with emotion. I don't know if I'll ever get the chance to look him in the eyes and thank him, but if I could, I would say, she paused, trying to hold back tears, that he didn't just save my life, he saved my family, he saved my future, because I wasn't just a hostage. I was a mother, and my little boy almost lost his mom that night. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. The woman took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. And, Sergeant Callahan, if you're watching this, I just want to say thank you. The image froze for a moment before the video ended. Jake blinked a few times. He swallowed hard. Trump set the tablet down on his desk and folded his hands together. You didn't just save soldiers, Jake. You saved mothers, fathers, children. You saved what America holds most dear. Jake felt his chest tighten. He had never thought of it that way before. He had never considered what happened to the people he rescued after the mission. Trump leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. And tomorrow, you're going to meet each and every one of them. Jake's eyes widened slightly. What? There's going to be a ceremony in your honor, Jake. But it won't just be about you. It will be about those you saved. They will be there, in person. Jake sat in stunned silence. Trump smiled. I hope you're ready for this. Jake took a deep breath. He stared at the polished wooden desk in front of him, reflecting on everything he had just heard. He didn't know if he was ready to relive that night, but one thing was certain. The past he had been trying to outrun had finally caught up with him, and now there was no escaping it. Jake Callahan walked out of the Oval Office feeling heavier than when he had entered. The hallways of the White House seemed endless, and every step echoed in his mind, along with President Trump's words, "They will be there in person." Until that moment, Jake had always avoided thinking about the hostages. He knew he had saved them, but he never wanted to know what happened afterward. He feared facing their faces and seeing something other than gratitude. He feared seeing the weight of the mission reflected in their eyes. He knew that, despite the success of the rescue, that day had not been a day of glory. It was a day of loss, of sacrifice. Some men never made it home, some friends were left behind, and now he would have to relive it all. The hotel and the shadows of the past. An official vehicle took him to a nearby hotel. As soon as he entered his room, Jake tossed his bag onto the bed and walked over to the window, looking out at the glowing skyline of Washington, D.C. He shut his eyes, trying to block out the memories, but it was impossible. Afghanistan always came back. A cold night, a firefight in hell. He was there again, the dark desert, the smell of burning dirt, the sound of gunfire slicing through the air. Callahan. We're surrounded. He clearly remembered the voice of Sergeant Mitchell, one of his teammates. The ambush happened fast. They had cautiously moved toward the village where the hostages were being held, but the terrorists had been waiting for them. Suddenly, explosions ripped through the night. Jake could recall every detail, the heat of the flames, the screams of pain, the radio crackling with static as they tried to regroup. He remembered the exact moment when he made the decision that changed his life. He ran alone, moved through the shadows, taking down enemies one by one until he reached the building where the hostages were chained. He could still hear their desperate whispers when he burst through the door. Please, get us out of here. Jake blinked hard and returned to the present. He was sweating. He gripped the bathroom sink, staring at his own reflection in the mirror. He didn't want to remember, but he knew that tomorrow he would have to relive every second of that mission. The phone rings. The hotel phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. He walked over and picked up the receiver. Hello? Jake? The voice made his heart stop for a moment. He would recognize that voice anywhere. It was Emily, his wife. Hey, are you okay? He hesitated for a moment. Yeah, just a little tired. On the other end of the line, Emily sighed. I saw on the news that you're in Washington. They're going to honor you, aren't they? Jake rubbed his forehead. He didn't like discussing these things with his wife. He knew Emily had gone through a lot while he was in Afghanistan. She had almost lost him during that mission. Yeah, the president is awarding me the Medal of Honor. There was a pause. You deserve it, Jake. He swallowed hard. I don't know if I do. Of course you do. You saved lives. He closed his eyes. But I didn't save everyone. Emily was silent for a moment. Jake, you've never been able to talk about that night. Maybe this is your chance to finally forgive yourself. Jake took a deep breath. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Then just go. Face the people you saved. See the impact you had on their lives. Do you think they'll look at you with guilt? No, Jake. They'll look at you with gratitude. And so will I. Jake ran a hand down his face. Are you and the kids going to watch it? Of course we are. The kids and I will be watching everything. His chest tightened. I just wish you were here. Emily chuckled softly on the other end of the line. Jake, we will be. He frowned. What do you mean? This was supposed to be a surprise, but we caught a flight. We're landing in the morning. Jake felt his throat tighten. You're coming to Washington. Yes, because this moment isn't just yours, it's ours, and we want to be with you when it happens. Jake took a deep breath. Thank you, Em. That means everything to me. We love you, Jake. Never forget that. He smiled for the first time that day. I love you too. When he hung up the phone, something inside him changed. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Tomorrow, he would face everything he had been avoiding for months, and this time he would do it with his family by his side. Jake Callahan woke up before sunrise. The clock read 5 a.m., but he had barely slept. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands over his face. Today was the day. In just a few hours, he would stand before the President of the United States, his fellow soldiers, the press, and, most importantly, the hostages he had saved. He clenched his fists at the thought. He had faced the horrors of war, survived gunfights, and escaped death countless times, but nothing had ever made him as nervous as this moment. Preparing for the biggest moment of his life. After a quick shower, Jake put on the formal dress uniform that had been left for him. He looked at himself in the mirror, momentarily stunned by his own reflection. No dust, no blood, no exhaustion from battle. Just a soldier, standing at attention, about to step into history. A knock at the door pulled him back to reality. Sergeant Callahan, your transport is ready. Jake opened the door and found a young Air Force officer waiting outside. He nodded, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out. The ride to the White House was silent. The streets of Washington were busier than the night before, and as Jake glanced at the digital billboards and news screens across the city, he saw his name everywhere. The soldier who defied death to save hostages, to be honored with the Medal of Honor. A true American hero, Jake Callahan, to be recognized in historic ceremony. Jake looked away. He had never liked the word hero. When they arrived at the White House, he was immediately escorted to a private waiting room. The ceremony would begin in less than 2 hours, and a team of military officials briefed him on the protocol. As they finished, a presidential aide approached him. Sergeant Callahan, President Trump would like to speak with you before the ceremony. He's waiting for you. Jake nodded and followed him down the hallway. Trump's final words before the ceremony. Inside the meeting room, President Trump was standing near the fireplace, reviewing a few documents. When he saw Jake, he smiled. "Ready to become the most talked about man in America." Jake exhaled sharply. "With all due respect, sir, I'd rather be back in Afghanistan on a mission." Trump chuckled, shaking his head. "I figured you'd say that. But listen, Jake, this isn't about you anymore." The president walked over to his desk and picked up a small blue velvet box. He opened it, revealing the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. Jake swallowed hard. Trump looked at him. "You might not like the attention, but you need to understand something. What you did matters. It inspires people. Young Americans will look at you and see what it truly means to serve." Jake nodded slowly. Trump closed the box and held it firmly. "Now go. There's a whole nation waiting to thank you." Jake shook the president's hand and stepped out of the room. He had never been one for motivational speeches, but somehow those words settled something inside him. He was ready. The reunion he had been waiting for, and the one he didn't expect. As he returned to the waiting area, his heart stopped. Standing there, Emily and his children were waiting for him. Jake froze. His legs moved before his brain could catch up, and in seconds his wife was in his arms. "You came," he whispered. "I promised, didn't I?" His kids, ages 7 and 10, clung to him tightly. "We're so proud of you, Dad," his eldest said. Jake shut his eyes, holding them close. Emily cupped his face in her hands. "Now go out there and show the world the incredible man you are." He nodded, took a deep breath, and turned toward the hall where the ceremony was about to begin. But before stepping inside, he saw something that made his heart stop. Seated in the front row, in chairs marked as VIP guests, were the hostages he had saved. Jake halted. They were there, alive, with their families, and they were all looking at him with nothing but gratitude. He felt a lump in his throat. For the first time since that mission, he realized that no matter what had happened that night, they were here. And now he was finally ready to accept that. The room was packed. High-ranking military officials, politicians, veterans, and families of fallen soldiers filled every seat. At the back, reporters and television crews prepared to broadcast the ceremony live to millions of Americans. Jake Callahan stood just outside the hall, waiting for his cue. His gaze swept the massive room. The American flags hung proudly in every corner, and a large screen displayed his name alongside a powerful phrase, "A soldier who left no one behind." He swallowed hard. This was real. On the main stage, a podium bore the presidential seal. To its side, an empty chair awaited him. Donald Trump was already at the front, speaking with generals and senior officials. Jake inhaled deeply. He was trained for battle, for staying calm under pressure, but standing in front of the entire nation, receiving the Medal of Honor, felt like the hardest thing he'd ever done. A young Air Force officer tapped his shoulder. "Sergeant Callahan, it's time." Jake nodded and stepped forward. A moment that stopped America. The second Jake entered the room, something incredible happened. The entire audience rose to their feet. Applause erupted like a thunderstorm. This wasn't polite, formal clapping. This was a standing ovation filled with admiration and respect. Jake's chest tightened. He walked forward in measured steps, keeping his posture straight, but inside, something was breaking. He had never wanted recognition. He had spent months avoiding this moment, but now, in this room full of strangers, he felt something unexpected. Acceptance. In the front row, he spotted Emily, his children, and the hostages he had saved. Their eyes were full of emotion. Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. The president's speech. Trump stepped up to the podium and waited for the applause to settle. When the room fell silent, his voice carried across the hall. "Today, we honor a man who embodies everything America stands for: courage, determination, and an unshakable commitment to his brothers in arms. He turned to Jake. "Sergeant Callahan, your name will be remembered, not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of the American spirit." The audience applauded again. Trump continued, "That night in Afghanistan, with your team wounded and the mission on the verge of failure, you made a choice. A choice that most would call reckless, even suicidal, but you didn't hesitate. You didn't think about yourself. You thought about your fellow soldiers. You thought about your duty. You thought about the Americans who needed you." Jake's hands curled into fists at his sides. He remembered every second of that mission. Trump reached for the small blue box on the table beside him. "And for your extraordinary bravery, for your unwavering dedication to this nation, I have the privilege of awarding you the Medal of Honor." The room exploded into applause. Jake took a deep breath and stepped forward. What he never expected. He stood at attention as Trump approached with the medal. He felt the cold weight of the medal as the blue ribbon was placed around his neck. For a moment, time stood still. This was real. The highest military honor in the United States now rested against his chest. The crowd rose in applause again. Jake held his posture, but suddenly something happened that caught him completely off guard. A woman in the front row stood up. Jake recognized her instantly. She was the woman from the video Trump had shown him, one of the hostages he had saved. She clutched something tightly in her hands, a folded American flag. The room fell completely silent. She took a step forward. Jake's breath caught, the gift that broke him. The woman's voice trembled, but she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sergeant Callahan," she swallowed hard. "My name is Claire Thompson. I'm one of the people you rescued that night in Afghanistan." Jake felt his chest tighten. She held the folded flag a little closer. "I already thanked you once, but now I want to give you something on behalf of all of us." She extended the flag toward him. "This belonged to someone you saved that night, my husband, Captain David Thompson." Jake felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath him. He remembered Captain Thompson, a brave soldier, one of the most injured hostages. He didn't make it. Jake's hands trembled as he reached out and took the flag. The fabric felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Claire's eyes were full of tears as she continued, "I know you feel like you didn't save everyone, but for me, you saved everything I had. My husband may be gone, but my son and I are alive because of you." Jake pressed the flag against his chest. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then finally, he forced the words out. It was an honor to serve alongside him. Claire nodded and stepped forward, and in front of millions of Americans, she hugged him. A nation in tears. The entire room sat in stunned silence. Then, someone clapped, and in seconds, the whole audience was on their feet. The biggest standing ovation of the night shook the hall. Jake, a man trained to hold back emotion, closed his eyes and let the tears fall. The cameras captured everything. Jake holding the folded flag, Claire hugging him, Trump watching with quiet respect. And in that moment, an image was created that would live on forever. The story that touched America. The video of that moment spread like wildfire. Every news outlet replayed it. Social media exploded with messages. A true American hero. Jake Callahan reminds us what it really means to serve. We never leave anyone behind. But the most shared photo of the night was not of Trump placing the medal around his neck. It was the image of Jake holding the flag, hugging Claire. A simple moment, but it said everything. What it all meant for him that night. Jake sat in his hotel room, staring at the Medal of Honor and the folded flag. For years, he had run from the past. But tonight, for the first time, he understood. His sacrifice had meant something. It had saved lives. He glanced at his wife and children, asleep on the couch, and smiled. For the first time since that night in Afghanistan, Jake Callahan finally felt at peace. The ceremony had ended, but the impact of what happened that night was just beginning. Jake Callahan was no longer just a decorated soldier. He had become a national symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the American spirit. Inside the White House reception hall, journalists scrambled to capture his final words. Senior military officials lined up to shake his hand. Strangers who had never met him before looked at him with profound admiration. But for Jake, none of that mattered as much as what was about to happen next. Across the room, his wife and children stood waiting for him. Jake didn't hesitate. The hug that meant more than any medal. Emily smiled as he approached, but her eyes were filled with tears. When he reached her, he didn't need to say a word. She simply wrapped her arms around him. Jake held her tight. For long moments, he just stood there, breathing her in. The familiar scent of home, of safety, something he hadn't felt in far too long. "We're so proud of you," Emily whispered. Jake closed his eyes and exhaled. "I just wanted to come home." His youngest daughter tugged at his hand. "You are home, Daddy." Jake looked down at her and smiled. For the first time since that night in Afghanistan, he believed it. He was home. A nation moved to tears that evening. The internet exploded with reaction. Jake's speech, his embrace with Claire Thompson, the moment he held the folded flag, everything had gone viral. His face was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, national television, news outlets ran headlines like, "The hero America needed." A soldier, a sacrifice, a legacy. Never leave a man behind. Jake Callahan's message to the world. But perhaps the most shared moment of all was a single photograph. Jake, holding his wife, his children by his side, the folded flag in his hands. One simple image, yet it said everything. The unexpected invitation. The next morning, while still trying to process everything, Jake received an unexpected phone call. "Sergeant Callahan, this is the Secretary of Defense." Jake straightened in his chair. "Yes, sir. We'd like to invite you to do something special." Jake frowned. "What kind of something?" "We want you to speak to the next generation of soldiers. We want them to hear your story, from you." Jake hesitated. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, but then he thought about the young men and women who had just taken the oath to serve. He thought about what Trump had told him. "What you did inspires an entire generation." Jake sighed. "Sir, it would be an honor." The Secretary of Defense chuckled. "Good, because America needs more men like you." Jake looked out his hotel window. The morning sun was rising over Washington, D.C., and for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. He had always thought his mission had ended in Afghanistan, but now he realized it was just beginning. The next day, Jake Callahan stood at the entrance of Fort Benning, Georgia, one of the most prestigious military training bases in the United States. It had been years since he last set foot on a base like this. The familiar scent of metal, sweat, and damp earth filled the air. The distant sound of drill sergeants barking orders echoed through the morning mist. He wasn't here as a recruit, not as a soldier. He was here as an example. Hundreds of young men and women, fresh recruits, were seated inside the auditorium, waiting for him. He could see them from the hallway, all wearing crisp, new uniforms, eager yet uncertain, just like he had been once. An officer approached. "Sergeant Callahan, they're ready for you." Jake took a deep breath. He had walked into war zones. He had charged into enemy fire, but somehow this felt just as terrifying. He adjusted his jacket and stepped forward, facing the next generation. The moment Jake entered the auditorium, every single recruit stood up at attention. He swallowed hard. These weren't politicians or reporters. These were his people. He reached the podium, cleared his throat, and looked out at them. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, his voice, steady and full of conviction, filled the room. "I once sat where you are now," he began. The recruits hung on to every word. "I remember being young, hungry, ready to serve. I thought I knew what it meant to be a soldier. I thought I understood duty, sacrifice, honor." He exhaled sharply. I didn't. The room was silent. You don't learn those things in training. You don't learn them from books. You learn them when bullets are flying past your head. When you're carrying your brother on your back, bleeding out, praying he makes it home. You learn them when you look into the eyes of someone you just saved, someone who wouldn't be alive if you hadn't been there. He gripped the sides of the podium. And one day, you'll ask yourself, was it worth it? He looked each of them in the eye. And I can tell you right now, yes, every second, every sacrifice. A long pause. Then, suddenly, a young soldier in the front row stood up and saluted. Jake blinked in surprise. A second later, the entire room followed, every recruit standing, saluting him. Jake clenched his jaw, fighting the emotions rising in his chest. They weren't saluting him because of the medal. They were saluting him because he was one of them, because he understood. And in that moment, Jake Callahan knew his mission wasn't over. He would spend the rest of his life ensuring that those who came after him never forgot what it meant to serve. A final visit. A week later, Jake made a private visit to Arlington National Cemetery. Alone, dressed in a simple jacket, he walked through the rows of white tombstones. Eventually, he found the one he was looking for, Captain David Thompson. Jake knelt down. In his hands, he held the folded flag Claire had given him. He carefully laid it down on the tombstone. "Brother," he murmured, "I brought this back to you." The wind rustled through the trees. Jake ran his fingers over the name engraved in stone. For years, he had carried guilt. He had blamed himself for those he couldn't save. But today, kneeling in front of this grave, he finally understood something. It wasn't about who didn't make it home. It was about who did. And as long as he was alive, he would honor their legacy. Jake stood up, took a step back, and saluted. Never leave a man behind. Then he turned and walked away. The day America stood still to honor a hero. Jake Callahan never wanted to be called a hero, but he was. And now, the whole country knew it. The sun was setting over Arlington National Cemetery as Jake Callahan walked away from Captain Thompson's grave. The crisp autumn air carried the distant sound of flags flapping in the wind. For years, he had carried the weight of war, the faces of the men he couldn't save, the ghosts of the past that followed him home. But as he left that sacred ground, something felt different. For the first time, the weight was lighter. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that what he had done mattered, that his sacrifice had not been in vain. One last mission. Jake returned home to Texas, but life would never be the same. He was no longer just Sergeant Jake Callahan, United States Army. He had become a symbol. His story spread across the country, inspiring young soldiers, veterans, and everyday Americans. Requests poured in. Schools, military academies, veterans groups. They all wanted to hear from him, not because he was a war hero, but because he was proof that honor, sacrifice, and patriotism still meant something. One afternoon, he sat on the porch of his ranch, watching his children play in the yard. His phone buzzed. A new email. It was from the Pentagon. Jake, we'd like to discuss a leadership role at West Point. Your experience could help shape the next generation of officers. Let us know if you'd be interested." Jake stared at the screen for a long moment. For years, his mission had been to fight. Maybe now, his mission was to teach. He smiled to himself. Maybe he wasn't done serving just yet. A legacy that will never fade. Months after receiving the Medal of Honor, Jake's story was written into history. His speech at the White House was taught in military academies. The moment he held the folded flag became one of the most iconic images of modern American history. A statue was commissioned in his hometown, not of Jake in combat, but of him kneeling, placing a hand on a fellow soldier's shoulder. It wasn't about war, it was about brotherhood, because that was what mattered most. Not medals, not ceremonies, but the men beside him, the ones who came home and the ones who never did. The final chapter. One evening, years later, Jake Callahan stood on a stage at West Point Military Academy, facing a new class of cadets. He held up his Medal of Honor. "This doesn't make me a hero," he said. "It's just a piece of metal. The real honor is serving the man next to you." He looked out at the young faces, the future of the U.S. military. One day, you'll have to make a choice. You'll have to decide what kind of soldier you're going to be. And when that moment comes, remember this: never leave a man behind. The cadets stood as one, saluting him. And in that moment, Jake knew his mission would never end. Because as long as young men and women stood ready to defend their country, his legacy would live on. The day America stood still to honor a hero. Jake Callahan never asked to be a hero, but he was, and now his name would never be forgotten.